Uh, Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. On behalf of Workfare and Free, I'm very pleased to welcome you all to our latest session in our seminar series on the move conversations on labor and migration. It's my pleasure to see so many of our colleagues from both Ajivika and Workfare and Free and our network organizations, as well as several researchers and academics here. Thank you for joining us today. Um, Many of you are familiar with the work of Workfare and Free, but let me just take a moment to introduce ourselves and what we do. We are a research policy advocacy and practice organization founded with the commitment to advance worker-centric knowledge and action so that labor migration can become more secure and dignified. We mostly combine research, policy work, and teaching and training, which is all supported by and informed by our practice on the ground, both in the industrial centers of urban areas as well as in rural migration clusters. Workfare and Free has been conceived and incubated about 3 years ago by Ajivika Bureau, a pioneering workers' rights organization with a long presence in the Western Indian migration corridor. At Workfare and Free, we are a small team, but we are a diverse team from different academic backgrounds. And our inquiries are mostly rooted in the lived experiences of labor migrants. Some of the thematic areas that we sort of investigate are sort of include mapping of migration trajectories, trying to understand which are the new and emerging migration corridors or destinations that are or where, what are the source and destination areas, or what is the nature of circular migration in the country. We also try and explore questions around workers' health, safety, and well-being, more particularly on occupational safety and health. Gender and work is one of the very significant thematic areas of our work, and we also explore the intersection between labor migration and urban governance, and in especially in the emerging peripheral areas of the country. Uh, a lot of our work, besides research, is also to do with informing policy and informing various other practice-based work. We try and influence governments, industry association, small employers, and that's where our research feeds into. Just a couple of other verticals of our pillars of our work include education and capacity building, which where we support labor practitioners and activists from across the country who are working on securing labor rights of informal workers. We also conduct workshops for early career researchers and labor practitioners, and Divya has been one of our partnering friend and organization for conducting these seminars and workshops for young practitioners. This seminar series that that you all are part of today is almost, I think, eighth or ninth one in the series, where we've thought of this series as a space where we bring together diverse voices, both from scholars, researchers, and practitioners who are working at the intersection of labor, migration, and social justice. Uh, the idea of holding these conversations is to encourage a multidisciplinary dialogue on the evolving dynamics of labor and migration, and examine some of the complexities of these themes and what are the pressing challenges in both the local and global contexts. In these conversations, what we also try and do is to highlight the lived realities of migrant workers and try and go into the structural conditions that they navigate, and these conditions could be shaped by policies, by histories, by economic landscape, and so on. The idea again of this seminar series is to bring people who are working on contemporary concerns with rigorous research and practice on the ground to be able to share these understanding across groups. So today's seminar is titled Worksite Childcare Infrastructure for Migrant Women Workers in India, Reimagining Labor and Care. And I'm very, very pleased to welcome Dr. Divya Ravindranath today as a speaker. As many of you might know, Divya, she is a very prolific researcher and currently teaches at the Indian Institute for Human Settlements in Bangalore. She's also a dear friend and serves on the board of Workfare and Free. We're very happy to have you, Divya. Welcome to this seminar series. Divya's work lies at the intersection of informal labor, gender, urban inequality, and public health. She has led several research projects on women's paid and unpaid work, breastfeeding practices, and childcare at informal work sites. Divya, in a way, brings together a rich combination of rigorous scholarship and field based insights. And that's what is very significant for our talk today, where she will unpack some of the uh, health challenges and care infrastructure in urban informal economies. Also, her presentation promises for us a deep empirical work combined with theoretical insights as well as policy relevant recommendations, uh, wherein we think about how women are not only workers but also caregivers and how the policies must respond to this dual reality. Dr. Divya Ravindranath, she holds a master's in social work from Tata Institute of Social Sciences and a PhD from Washington University in St. Louis. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Divya Ravindranath. Before I give the floor to you, Divya, I'll quickly say a few introductory comments about the talk and what we expect. May I request the participants Yeah. So as I said earlier, today's talk or seminar is on worksite childcare infrastructure for migrant women workers in India and reimagining labor and care. The way I look at it is this conversation sort of sits at the intersection of two very urgent and often disconnected concerns. One is labor and the other one is care. And today we are focusing particularly on the experiences of migrant women workers who, in a way, form the backbone of our urban economies. But their realities and their experiences are often invisible in both labor law, labor policy, and childcare policy. So, in a way, this talk sort of this talk on worksite childcare infrastructure is in quite novel and timely, and we'll also reflect upon how it can support women's participation in labor force by ensuring access to quality childcare. And this is particularly important because India is one of the lowest female labor force, sees one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the world, and it's been declining in the last 2 decades, except some rise now, and there have been contentions around that as well. So in this context, it's usually even when women want to work or they need to work, the lack of accessible and reliable childcare is seen as one of the most significant barriers. And this is particularly acute for women in informal workforce as well as women who are migrant to cities and who navigate unfamiliar environments where they have to work and support their kids and other caregiving responsibilities with very limited support, temporary housing, and they're almost always in precarious jobs. Usually, we assume that if women are skilled or if we offer them jobs, they will automatically join the workforce. But we sort of ignore the invisible care work that they carry out alone, almost disproportionate responsibility of care work that they carry out. And without investing in infrastructures of care and the very important subject that Divya is going to talk to us today about, we are asking women to do the impossible. We are telling them to labor without support and to care without recognition. And this is something that's critical that we will discuss today. And it also highlights a very critical gap in our labor rights discourse. Because when we talk about labor rights in India, we usually talk about wages, job security, safety, and social protection. And often the responsibility of care is seen as a private burden of the responsibility of the family and moreover of the woman, right? So it's in this context that I would like to place this talk. And just to quickly see that this some of these concerns are not new, right? So historically, maternity benefits and childcare facilities have sort of developed through they're almost 100-year-old concern, right? But they've developed along separate trajectories. It was the maternity benefits that came has the longest journey in the Indian context, where say for instance from the 1920s when we had Baba Sahib Ambedkar, who was speaking in the Bombay Legislative Councils, very strongly arguing for maternity as not an individual concern, but as something that's a responsibility of both the state and the employers, right? For Ambedkar, maternity benefit was not charity, it was compensation for reproductive labor that sustained society itself. And it was these ideas that shaped the later Maternity Benefit Act and much later the 2017 amendment of this, which mandated creche facilities to be set up in establishments with over 50 employees, right? Earlier, prior to this, we did have the childcare at the workplace in the Factories Act of 1948, which required creches for women in factories if they were more than 30, right? So there has been this historical trajectory where there have been attempts to bring together maternity benefits and childcare infrastructure, but they have I'm hoping that Divya will take us through some of these nuances and complexities in greater detail, and what do these mean in the Indian context. And some of the contentions have been about who pays for this, whether it's the employer, the state, or the family, and who is covered, whether it's formal or informal workers. And so it's some of these questions that will open up for us in this conversation could include what does absence of child how does absence of childcare affect women's ability to work and stay in work? What would it mean to treat childcare as infrastructure? And I'm hoping Divya will open this up for us. What are some of the models that we can see around us, whether it's community-led or initiatives of civil society organizations, which we can learn from, institutionalize, and scale up? And can we build a shared responsibility between employers, state, and society? So, with these few questions, the floor is open to you, Divya. And thank you for joining us and uh, initiating some of these conversations.
Thanks, Geeta, and thanks for that wonderful sort of setting up of the context because it does help me jump straight into it. I'll just share my presentation and let me know if it's working. Yeah, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. So good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. I can also see some old friends on the webinar. Hi to all of you. Um, well, this work started actually quite by accident for us at IIHS. I did my PhD on maternal and child health of migrant workers at construction sites. And one of the things that was quite obvious as we were doing, as I was doing my data collection at that point, and this was about a decade ago, was that caregiving was a huge challenge for migrant workers at work sites. At that time, I was doing my work at construction sites, but it's also true of many other types of work sites, which I'll briefly talk about today. And in the past few years, childcare suddenly has become a very big buzzword. There's a lot of money that's coming from philanthropy, from the government, a lot of investment in childcare. But the fear really is that sometimes when we talk about childcare so aggressively, without actually talking about all the inequalities that are set, inequities that are set within the childcare process, what does it do within the household? What does it do within the community? What does it do to women's work itself? I think it would be a rather big disservice to the discourse. So what I'm going to try and do today is actually draw from a couple of different bodies of literature, a little bit from the very long scholarship, feminist scholarship on care itself, a little bit on migration and informality and the challenges that brings in. And then towards the second half of my talk, I will move towards thinking about what are some of the pathways that we can take towards
Divya, your
care
voice
itself.
is speaking.
Oh no, can you hear me now?
Yeah, it's better.
Okay, sorry, my internet just today has to act up a bit difficult. So I'll just start with a very basic introduction to the language of care itself, because I know many people who are on the webinar today must be more familiar with the labor and informality conversation, but perhaps not so much on, what's happening on the side of care. So remember, care is something that we all experience in our daily lives. It is something that's, very fundamental to our everyday well-being. Uh, it is, absolutely critical for our everyday sustenance and maintenance, both for ourselves, but also for future generation. The fact that you can go to work the next day, a child can go to school, an individual can make it, happy on the other side. is because there is some kind of care that is being provided within the household. Now, this could be in the form of, basic domestic chores, like somebody's washing your clothes, somebody's cleaning for you, but it could also be emotional, a more sort of human to human connection, or under the ambit of care. Now, as a form of work, and I talk as a work, as a form involves what research called several ability factors. And what does this mean? It requires material resources, it requires structural resources, but it also requires knowledge. So care is not very easy. We all think it's very natural to women, but actually care requires considerable, passed on knowledge or acquired knowledge about how to actually provide care. It requires skill, and most importantly, it also requires time. A very rarely sort of recognized factor, but caregiving is extremely time consuming on an everyday basis. And as Gita had briefly also, referred to this, it is also very imperative that we ask who provides care. It's within the household, in the community, at the state level. So, who's providing care? Where is this care taking place? And to whom? Who is the receiver of this care? All of these are very important conversations that feminists have sort of brought out in the last couple of decades. Now, of course, traditionally, care has occurred within the realm of the house, with women disproportionately bearing the burden of care. So you will see that the site of care itself is the household, or the corners of the home. And for a very long time, scholars have argued that it is important to move care giving and the idea of care from purely being something that happens within the domestic sphere to the public sphere. That who is responsible for it? That's the question, right? So it's not just the household, but also the other stakeholders who are responsible for caregiving. And this is, of course, with reference to various types of care, whether it's elderly care, child care, caring for the ill, disabled. In today's talk, I'm only going to focus on childcare, but broadly, this literature is also about various forms of paid and unpaid care that takes place within our society. Now, when I come to childcare and women's work, there is a lot of economists have debated for very long what does the burden of childcare do to women's work. And there is, of course, a lot of literature that it pushes gender inequalities, which means that women can't enter the labor force because they have the caregiving burden, or even if they're in the labor force, they always have reduced earnings. So either they do, part-time work or do work that isn't actually to the best of their ability. Because
Uh,
they go to work, they don't care for the child. Still can't
Div-
hear me again.
Sorry to interrupt. We are not able to hear you in between. Maybe you both of
Oh,
us can be turning off our video, so then you will have less of your bandwidth taken.
okay, sure.
If that works.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. You can switch off. Okay, is it better now?
Yes.
Okay, also do a time check in a
Yeah,
bit.
you can go on up
Um,
to. Yeah.
yeah, okay.
Okay. Yeah.
So when you think about, what happens in the absence of care infrastructure, women, of course, still have to care for their children, but the environments are very unconducive. So this could mean leaving the child alone at home, leaving the child with a neighbor, or with an older sibling, or somebody who's in the vicinity, because there is no other reliable childcare infrastructure. But even while doing that, while having this everyday negotiation, women also have to engage in paid work and undertake household chores, what feminists have called the triple burden of work. So that is childcare, household chores, as well as work. Very experience you're having to provide care, and also taking child to the place of work and the safety concern that they have. So imagine a child at a construction site constantly at risk of falling objects, huge machinery, sharp things, the pollution, cement, dust, and so on. So there's constantly the worry of the child being unsafe, and but at the same time, income generation still has to happen to sustain the family. Now, lack of public infrastructure, any care that happens in the public sphere coupled with deficit of care, as I explained, because you can't do it within the household effectively, has deep implications for the household itself, and I'll come to that in a bit, and also for their children in terms of their long-term, well-being and health and nutrition status. Of course, in the last couple of decades, the policy landscape in India has tried to address this problem in many, many ways. So, for example, the first thing that is the Benefits Act of 1961. It does think of childcare infrastructure as being very central to the idea of maternity benefits or social protection in some form. So in India, the Maternity Benefits Act asks for childcare to be provided by the employer in any establishment that has 50 or more employees. So if the childcare center has to be at the workplace or near the workplace, or in many cases, if they can't have it within the workplace, it's at least subsidized by the employer. But remember that the Maternity Benefit Act, in India, it's perhaps one of the most generous ones in the world. But in India, where more than 90% of the female labor force is in the informal sector, where the employer-employee relationship cannot be formally shown through contract, this sort of falls flat because construction workers or workers in the garment industry are unable to avail of the benefits of this act because they simply can't show the relationship between the employer and employee in the sense of it being a formal relationship. Similarly, the Code of Social Security also suggests that there has to be a creche within or near the work site, and women are also allowed visits to the child for breastfeeding and so on. More recently, sometime last year, the government of India pushed for the Palna scheme under the Mission Shakti. It is by far the most sort of comprehensive policy, which also takes into account the fact that the Maternity Benefits Act is not reaching all women. And of course, the main reason for the Palna scheme is to push for women's labor force participation, but also child safety and early childhood development, that is for children under the age of 3 when the women are out at work. So the Palna scheme is quite comprehensive. And it's perhaps a great addition to our larger policy landscape of maternity benefits. The BOCW Act, that is the Building and Other Construction Workers Act of the 1996, also has some provisions for childcare. But we know that across all of these programs and schemes and policies, one of the biggest problems is that migrant workers completely fall through the gaps or the cracks because they do not have access to these schemes when they are at the work site. And I'll explain as we move along why. Say, for example, the Palna scheme, it says within a kilometer of the residence, the place of residence, there should be a Palna center. But if a migrant worker is living at a work site, where does that 1 kilometer go, right? And it's not possible for the migrant worker to access it outside of the work site when they're living and working there. So there are fairly big complications with each of these acts and policies, and they remain inaccessible to migrant workers. When we talk about the sort of intersection of migration, informality, and childcare, we must remember that a very large proportion of internal migrant households within India, like in many other parts of the global south countries, like the African continent or Latin America, they engage in informal work, which is typically marked by poor work and living conditions, low wages, and of course very minimal social protection. Much of this work occurs at work sites like construction sites, garment factories, brick kilns, and so on. And the big challenge is that these work sites are often very dispersed. So they're not concentrated necessarily in one place. They're often, across the city or at the outskirts or peripheries of the city. They're very unregulated. So, there aren't enough labor inspections to know if there's a creche working or not. Of course, they're also very unsafe for children to be at present at the work site. And very often, like in the case of construction sites, they're also temporary. So as soon as the project is over, the project is, so the workers belong to scheduled time and scheduled caste groups engage in family-based migration. That is, the entire family migrates together. And it is known well in literature that when women migrate, children also migrate with them because women are the primary caregivers to their children. But interestingly, in the literature, while there is a lot of documentation, and we have very rich sort of scholarship on migration in India. This scholarship has mostly looked at the precarity that the workers experience, and there is very little documentation or studies, very little sort of understanding of what happens to children. Apart from saying yes, they're not doing too well, that there's effects on their well-being. But apart from that, there haven't been any long-term studies or cohort studies on migrant children who come to the city with their parents. But the transient nature of migrant workers and their living arrangements, which is generally at an informal site, a work site, or at a temporary, under tarpaulin sheds in the city somewhere, it fundamentally really hinders their ability to provide for childcare. So, for example, first, they don't have access to government programs like Palna, the ICDS, or even healthcare facilities while they're in the city. State or market at work in terms of childcare provision through their own community members. For migrant workers, that's often absent. They also don't have access to, social infrastructure like family members or neighborhood communities or other networks on whom they can rely for childcare provisioning. So it has to be done by the family themselves, and of course, it's mostly the woman or the mother who's responsible for it. And as a result of this, parents are forced to take their children to work, and this has deep consequences both for the mother and the child. For the mother, this means negotiating very unsafe and suboptimal childcare arrangements, keeping the child right next to her so she can breastfeed or keep an eye on the child. So in a jhula right next to the work site, even though she's well aware that the child is constantly exposed to poor work environments. It also means that the child constantly falls sick because of exposure to environmental pollution, but also heat exposure as of today, which exacerbates ill health, and the mother has to take leave over and over again to care for the child. She loses a lot of time juggling childcare while also trying to do paid work, which has an impact on her earnings. And one thing that we rarely talk about is the mental health impact on the women because of this very high stress, which of course also lowers her productivity, but also has impacts on the overall well-being of the mother. For the children, lack of safe spaces, but it also means no learning opportunities. There is always a risk of illness or injury because of the environment that they are in. And there's limited access to healthy meals and nutritional diets. There's very high reliance on, quick to eat, ready to eat products, chips, biscuits, cold drinks, and so on, because the mother has to work 10, 12 hours a day. There's very high exposure to pollutants. And of course, there's also intergenerational movement into labor because the children have very little access to education, and as a result, very quickly enter the labor force and often end up doing the same kind of work that their parents have done. So about 3, 4 generations, we've seen that children have come back into the same labor force. But what do crashes at work sites really enable us to do, right? In daily life, our assumption is that the state is responsible for childcare, if not the family. But in daily life, migrant workers are more likely to interact with the employer than with the state because that engagement is often not possible when the worker is living at the work site. And it's really interesting because in the labor discourse, it's often, the language is that the responsibility of social protection is on the employer because it's not a formal employer-employee relationship, and also because the state is responsible for migrant workers. But we found that the state barely is visible to the migrant worker, or migrant worker has very few opportunities to engage with the state directly. Under such circumstances, the employer really has to take responsibility for childcare, and I'll explain a little further. Think of childcare, there are very specific kinds of negotiations and engagements that have to be taken, that have to take place with the employer, with other stakeholders like state, local authorities, the labor department, and so on. So it's not easy to just run care infrastructure at a work site. It requires multiple points of negotiations with everybody who's responsible or is present at the work site. Under these circumstances, we need childcare models that are both adaptable, so they sort of, work within an informal works environment, but also accessible to migrant workers at the work site. So we have to think really creatively on what these possible models can look like. And that is how we came to, start studying these models that NGOs run in various parts of the country, which really have emerged as a very viable, interesting set of interventions for migrant workers. And they are, without doubt, a very important actor in setting up and managing childcare infrastructure. But unfortunately, these models have not been studied. Very often, they're talked about as being, just spread out, dispersed interventions, but actually there are quite a few in the country. And so my colleagues and I set out to study these models to understand so what I present next is some of these findings from various work sites and our conversations with NGOs, but also thinking about what is the importance of these childcare centers, both for the woman and the child, but also for the community of migration. And why is it important for us to think about the childcare center as quite fundamental to women's work, especially migrant women's work at work sites? Now, we all know that childcare is a very fundamental form of care. When we say the word care, we often think first of childcare, right? It happens across the world. But the big question is, where should it occur? Should it be in the public? Should it be a private or a community collective? But that is the important question to answer, because that will tell us how do we think of the shared responsibility between various stakeholders. Now, in the case of migrant households, there is, of course, no access to state-led childcare infrastructure. The state simply doesn't have the capacity to go to every individual work site and start a childcare center there. But also there is no market-led infrastructure, though you will see that in many informal settlements, and of course there are the more expensive ones, but also the inexpensive ones, because the market has no incentive to cater to migrant workers and make it affordable for them. But yet, migrant workers spend about 10 to 12 hours a day at the work site, and they perhaps even live there in many kinds of sectors of work. And so the work site becomes a really important site where this delivery has to take place and where this care infrastructure has to come into being. So what NGOs have interestingly done, as they've talked about care as a very central value. But what we found is that there is a very interesting language and ethic that they try to pass on and negotiate with the employer to make it happen. Because simply saying that you need to care for your workers isn't going to really help move the needle in any ways. So there's a very interesting set of language, negotiations, vocabulary that the NGOs have started using to be able to run these crèches at the work site. And childcare centers, one of the things that we found, and it's really important, is that they not only support, but they actively enhance the possibilities of care at work sites. So they not only look after children for 8 hours or 10 hours a day, but they also support women when they go back home to be able to care for their child through information, knowledge, basic skills, and also just being the kind of support that women lack in the absence of a community or family in the city. Um, the reason we started also studying these NGO models was because we thought of all the ways in which they brought incremental change in the care infrastructure space, but also because they provided many pathways for some change for workers' everyday lives. And we thought it would be very useful and important to document and study these more systematically, especially because they have been unrecorded so far as an important stakeholder. So what is the logic NGOs go to the employers, construction sites, garment factories, and use the Maternity Benefits Act as a clause, or to talk about the BOCW, or talk about just the pure legal responsibility the employer has if a child meets with an accident or there's an injury or in case of a death at work sites. And there have been many of that, newspapers always carry cases, recent one in Kerala. And there's been in Maharashtra as well, where children have succumbed to injury or death because of worksite accidents. And so legal responsibility generally works as a negotiation tactic tool with large builders and with large employers. However, legal responsibility is not something that small employers are really concerned about, because they simply don't think it's going to affect their work in that sense. So the other language that the NGOs also use is that of economic benefits. We've seen how there has been systematic documentation of how looking after the child reduces women's burden of care, because of which she can work long hours or carry out more complicated tasks or do better work. At construction sites, it could be something as small as a woman being sent to a floor above to do cement work taken care of. To women staying longer at the work site because the child is taken care of. So there are a lot of economic benefits that are spoken about. It's also interesting that once we were invited to a conversation with a builders association, and one of the first things he told us is, I let you into the meeting, but I don't want you to use the terms welfare, workers' rights, or justice. You tell us how does it benefit us in terms of our business. So economic benefits is really the language that the employers are often looking for. It also helps with worker retention. I think this is a major concern in, say, the garment industry, where once the work is learned, if a woman leaves, then it's very complicated for the employer to find the same size of the workforce again, and so they prefer to have the same worker work over a long period of time. It also helps build a positive market image. So a lot of NGOs convince employers, saying that among the buyers, among the industry, they would have a positive market and image, and hence they should invest in childcare, and it seems to be working in some sense. Why is employer engagement essential, right? One, because the construction of the creche has to happen at the work site. So there is some kind of support that the employer has to give. It's also important for the sustenance. So, basically paying the fee of the workers who are looking after the creche, the food that the children are given, basic maintenance, things like upgrades of, during summer, putting insulation, or during winter, having some kind of carpets for the children, and so on. So employers' engagement is absolutely critical for running these creches. It's also important because it helps them move into the future projects. So if once an employer sees the benefit of a creche, and we've spoken to several employers who've said that they actually see the benefit of creches and are willing to take it forward to other projects that they begin in the future as well. One of the things that we've been trying to look at is, thinking of childcare infrastructure not merely as a caregiving sort of center, but one that is also deeply tied to social protection and the rights of a worker, or the entitlements of a worker. While it's absolutely critical that we create a safe and nurturing environment for the well-being of children, it is also about other forms of, especially in terms of having meetings, organizing and mobilizing workers, making sure that they're enrolled in various government programs, and so on.
Sorry to
Yeah.
interrupt. If you could just repeat your last point, because we lost you for a bit and I thought this was
Uh,
critical. Yeah, thank you.
okay. So when we think about the child care centers, I don't want us to imagine of them, them being just care centers where children are coming and sitting through the day, but also to think about its connections to social protection. Um, in the imagination of the Maternity Benefits Act, for example, or the Palna scheme, childcare is being spoken about as social protection. And that's actually quite important, because it is an entitlement or a right of a worker to have access to these services. So when childcare infrastructure is available, it also becomes a place for organizing and mobilizing workers at work sites who otherwise are so spread out in the city that it's very difficult to sort of mobilize them very often. But when you have the care infrastructure, it often becomes a very easy space to get in touch with workers and actually have everyday conversations with them on the kinds of government programs they could be enrolled into. What are their various forms of social protection schemes that are actually even available in the public, because very often migrant workers don't even know what schemes are available because they're so busy working, right? So it becomes a really nice place for organizations, the NGOs, organizations to engage and mobilize and organize, especially women who very often are kept outside of mainstream unions. So I remember talking to a construction workers union a couple of years ago, and when I was talking about childcare, he said, "Abhi tak to, wages are not sorted out. Till today, working conditions are not sorted out. So why are you talking about crèches?" Now, of course, it sounds like a very distant problem, but for women, it's very fundamental to have childcare just for mental peace and for the ability to be able to engage in the workforce without having to undergo a lot of stress of childcare, right? So actually, childcare is not that down in the list of priority. It should be right on top because for the female workers, it's absolutely critical to have childcare. So the childcare center then becomes a place where other social protection interventions can be brought in, like the Dhanvantari scheme in Gujarat, for example, or the Annapurna Yojana, where food is given to workers at a subsidized cost, and so on. So the center becomes a place where other kinds of social protection interventions are assembled together. Okay. Here are just two excerpts from workers' interviews we did about, what's the importance of childcare centers, and there was a very resounding sort of emphasis on the fact that it actually reduces their worry about what's going to happen to the child, but also more importantly, it reduces other kinds of the burden of work. So, for example, the domestic chores, right? If the food is brought to the childcare center for the workers, the mothers have to cook, save their time from cooking, and can focus on paid work, or once they go back home, can engage with the child in a more playful manner because the food is taken care of and she has some free time on hand. So it really helps her free up time for many other activities. And the childcare center then becomes a place where all of these other interventions are assembled. Oops, sorry, I don't know what happened to the format. It also provides safety and learning opportunities. So the child is has access to better food, has access to more nutrition, and also safety, of course, and also the opportunity to learn and engage with some early childhood development material, which the mother very often is not able to engage with the child because she's so busy at work. But in our interviews, we've also found that the employers are also increasingly acknowledging that childcare is very important for the women. And so, for example, we found that, there is breastfeeding breaks that some places have given because there's a childcare center and the woman can go back to breastfeed her child. So there are these the childcare center becomes the first intervention, but piggybacking on that intervention, NGOs then negotiate with the employers on several other kinds of small leeways. So, getting a break for breastfeeding, getting a longer lunch break so she can engage with the child, leaving work early so that she can go and spend time with the child. So all of these negotiations start with the childcare center, but the childcare center is the first place that the employer is actually saying yes to. And then over a period of time, all of these other requests are finalized. And it's quite interesting because we look at the creche infrastructure priorities, toys and learning material, coolers and fans, especially in very hot regions, having some space to play and engage with, some kind of material instead of just being in front of a mobile screen or playing in the dust and mud. That seemed to be a great priority for the parents. In terms of what services did they require, it was really resounding. Majority of parents said education and safety and security, and of course, food and health checkup and vaccination. Very often, migrants have absolutely no opportunity even to take their children for vaccination, and the childcare center then becomes a place where the public health interface with the worker is made possible through these centers. I'm going to start concluding now, and I want us to think about care as a feminist practice, not just in terms of what does it mean to give care, but also to think about where is this care provided, and who has to be made responsible for care for the children of migrant workers. Of course, the first thing, the foremost and the most important thing is to recognize that mothers are also paid workers, and that paid workers are also mothers. Important to register that first up as the most important part of the labor discourse. Very often within the labor movement, this aspect is not focused on enough. And I think it's quite critical to the way women operate in the paid work environment. It is also important, and we found this with a lot of NGOs, that they're constantly sort of traversing the space between justice and ethic. While having childcare centers for the child is really important, it is a matter of equality and justice and some kind of equity within our urban areas. That is a language they're unable to use with the employers, and so a lot of language then becomes around the idea of ethic, right? What is the ethic of it? The ethic of care, making sure that there is some kind of childcare provisioning so that it's an ethic of business and so on. So this constant negotiation between making sure that the children get some form of infrastructure, access to infrastructure, but at the same time, it's also an ethic that the employer is responsible for. And so we see that the care is not, reflected or articulated as a universal subjective ethic of care or justice, but very often it's described as something that's situated and relational. So it's something that's delivered through a particular care infrastructure. So it's not to just say that the employer is responsible for the child, but to say the employer has to build infrastructure where caregiving is going to be made possible. And for that, you need the third party, which in this case is an NGO. But there are, of course, some community-based models also that we've seen through various other NGOs. But this engagement is also absolutely critical, because when we ask the question, who provides care or where, it also means actually investing in the process of childcare. So there's budgetary allocations that have to be made, constant negotiation and engagement with the government, so that the welfare programs budgets are also extended to migrant children. Very often, you'll see that the government program is not available to migrant children because they were never sort of thought about it, right? So there was no budget for it. Or to make sure that the Labor Department comes and does some inspection at work sites to ensure and enforce the setting up of childcare infrastructure at work sites. So it's not just enough to talk about care, but also to think about all the various practices and interventions that come along with that, and what does it enable us to do vis-a-vis the rights and entitlements of workers at the work sites. More importantly, it's also about integrating care into the urban environments and thinking about how it requires planning, the notion of equity and distribution of resources, and thinking where is the location of care. So it's not just enough to provide care at the place of residence, but you also have to think of care at the place of work. And in case of migrant workers, especially because they live there, they also work there. And so when you talk about the universal need for care, to say that the universalization of care also has to take the workplace in account when you talk about it in everyday life. And we found that the care conversation often is an opening point, is the opening to several other conversations around housing, and found that at a lot of work sites, employers are willing to contribute once they start seeing the benefits of this in terms of retention and better quality of the workforce. Just in terms of conclusion, we need to start thinking about childcare infrastructure at the city level. How can we make it more accessible and inclusive, but also account for the social and economic geographies of cities? Where are these work sites located? How do we ensure that within the planning landscape of the city, there is space earmarked for childcare infrastructure so that mothers can go to work and do quality work, right? And what are the temporal, especially for migrant workers, what are the temporal and locational needs, and where is it the childcare can be provided? But if there is no such contextualization, what happens is then women continue to be, bearing the burden of childcare within the private domestic sphere because there is absolutely no infrastructure that supports them through this caring process. And the absence of formal contract between the employer and the employee, of course, makes it very difficult to hold employers accountable. But that is no reason for not having employers, involved in the process. And we found that more than it is the employers who uh, for the acts of the workers. And creche often is a great starting point to have some of these conversations. I'll stop here. I just want to also acknowledge all the other team members who have been part of very long-term projects that we've been doing in multiple states. There's Gautam, Antara, Vrashali, Neha, Tabassum, and Tasneem and Shimoy, all of who have been part of this care infrastructure project at various points in time. Geeta, I hope I'm on time. I'll pause here.
Thank you, Divya. Perfectly on time.
Great.
Thanks again, Divya. Thank you so much for that very insightful and very thought-provoking presentation. Before we open the floor for questions and discussion, I thought maybe I should just take a couple of minutes to highlight some of the key things that you've laid out for us. One is this reflection that you've done of the structural exclusion of migrant workers, which is very significant, and particularly both the productive and reproductive labor of women workers, particularly that's invisibilized. It's cities that want their labor but not their children or providing any kind of care infrastructure for them. So it's the structural exclusion that you brought out for us is so significant. And second, I thought another important aspect that your presentation brings out for us is that how uh, childcare infrastructure could look like in these very mobile and precarious, dispersed settings, and what kind of advantages they provide both to women, women's labor, and in terms of organizing workers. I think that is particularly significant from the labor rights, labor discourse, labor organizing point of view, also to sort of highlight enough that it's not just the health, the immediate work and that's taken care of by providing childcare infrastructure on work sites, but it is also how it is a space for mobilizing and organizing workers. Uh, and another important thing I thought your presentation brings out is how to foreground the voices and experiences of migrant women workers themselves, which your presentation has done very nicely. To say that that this cannot be an afterthought, or it cannot be a prioritizing based on our experience or understanding of what is a labor rights issue, but what are women, migrant women workers feeling and thinking about these kinds of concerns, and where does it fall within their own priorities. So I thought these are some of the things that really came out very well in your presentation, Divya. And maybe if I could just ask a couple of questions and then we can open the floor. One is that you were emphasizing on the critical role of employers. So again, I would think that uh, it's possible to persuade large employers, big employers, to provide care infrastructure at their work sites. How do we think of it from the point of view of, say, smaller employers, whether it is MSMEs, for example, or if we were to think of it from the perspective of women who are in sectors like domestic work, or in I'm sure you've done that kind of work too. So if you can just tell us how we can think of it from women who are part of those kind of sectors, right? And other question I had was, there's also a lot of emphasis on how uh, crash compliance is extremely low despite some of these provisions. So how do we think about questions of compliance?
Yeah, so to your first question on how do we negotiate with smaller employers, I mean that's something we've also been thinking about quite a bit. And of course, if you just have say 10 workers, it's perhaps not viable for the employer to think about a crash. But in the case of MSMEs and garment factories, some NGOs have also tried the cluster approach where couple of different employers pool in together to build one crash in their vicinity, such that and so on. But it does require many months and perhaps even years of negotiations with the employers, the group of employers to make this happen. Which is why I think it's also very important to engage with employers' bodies, like the CREDI in the case of construction sector, where some, negotiations with them and engagement with them can push for an industry level standard for this to happen. And I know in some cities it's more actively being done than the others, but that's perhaps one way to go about it. In the case of domestic workers, we have to explore completely different models. So that's like the community-based model, place where they live, because here the employers are very dispersed. The domestic worker goes to 5, 6 employers' home, so it can't be at the employer's place because she wouldn't be at that place beyond a few hours. So in that case, it has to be at the settlement level where the woman is present. So we do have to think about a range of interventions. It can't be one, which is why I said even though we push for universal care, the universal care doesn't mean it's agnostic to space and location and time. We have to think about it both simultaneously. We have to push for universal care, but we also have to say it has to happen within certain contexts and certain environments, and the temporality of the workers also. How many hours are they at work? What time of the day are they at work? Where do they go to work? All of these are questions we can't shy away from. And because it's so messy, I guess we don't want to talk about it, right? I think that's the reason we really need to think through all of these steps when we talk about childcare.
Thanks, Divya. Maybe you can come to the compliance question towards later part of
Sorry, I missed it. I can answer that also quickly. So, in terms of compliance, of course, it is the job of the Labor Department to go and make sure that there is compliance. But very often, when you say childcare, then they'll say it's the maternal and child development department, right? Like WCD. Why should we care about it within the labor department? But actually, that's not the case because it's part of the very fundamental rights. No, it's not fundamental rights in that sense, but fundamental entitlements of a female worker at the workplace within the Maternity Benefits Act, or within the BOCW Act. So in some sense, there has to be compliance, which the Labor Department is responsible for, and which is why I really like this model that the Karnataka government runs a program called the Kusina Mane, where the panchayat is responsible for the childcare intervention. Because clearly one of the articulations says why should only the WCD be responsible for childcare? It should be thought of basic infrastructure along with a school or a hospital or a PHC. Childcare infrastructure should be that basic at the village level. So we have to think about it as a matter of inspection that the Labor Department does at the work site.
Thank you, Divya. And now we'll open the floor for questions, comments, reflections from the participants. Please introduce yourself before you speak. Yeah, Thoran, please go ahead.
Hi, Geeta, and hi, Divya. Thank you so much for such an insightful presentation and looking at childcare from a very different infrastructure perspective. I'm working with Social Compact. We've come across this question on accessibility to creche many times when we work with companies. So we basically work with companies, understand what their practices are, and then we help them strengthen their practices, which are more worker inclusive. We often see companies having, even if they have a child care, and when we spoken to, I mean, creche, and when we spoken to the workers themselves deny that they don't want a creche facility. Or even if a creche facility is there, they don't want to use it. And their reasons can be very varied. They don't feel it's safe for their children. The atmosphere is not safe. It's too far. They have to travel for so long and come to the factory site. A factory could have hazardous chemicals, air. They also feel that just in general, the common notion that is that my child is safe at home. That thing of being safe at home and not at the work site. In such a scenario, we always find ourselves to be in a milieu to what do we advise to the companies, right? Like, should we tell them that do have a crash when your workers only are not giving you an uptake? Yeah, so it's just more of a comment, and if you have any thoughts on it, it would be great.
See the challenge happening. I mean, we've seen that at a lot of construction sites also very often. If it's the first time, obviously parents are, it's difficult for them to trust their child with somebody else. All of us would be very concerned if we don't, trust the space and the worker who's looking after the child. I think it has to be a mix of both interventions at the workplace and interventions at the informal settlement if they are living in a particular area, because some parents would be most comfortable with leaving their child behind. And which is why initially when I said they need to think of childcare infrastructure within the planning landscape of the country, right? So when you have informal settlements, it has to be a community-based model that works there. So it has to be a mix and match of these various infrastructure possibilities. And I think the more we have these, the more trust trusting parents will also be, because they've seen this somewhere. They know the model exists. They know what benefits or advantages it has. And I think linking it to other forms of social protection is also useful then, because it becomes a place where they can come for. It's also like a labor intervention site, where they can come for multiple other things to raise their concerns. So it's not just a childcare, but sort of a larger intervention in some sense.
Katyayani?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Divya. Nice hearing you after a long time. My comment, more or less, my comment is you have not referred to the Interstate Migrant Workmen's Act at all, or even the Contract Labor Act. I know you have referred to the Code on Social Security, but that is not yet in place. And until the code is not in place, these laws continue to be in place. So the Interstate Migrant Workmen Act clearly says there has to be a creche for the workers. I don't remember how many workers it mandates should have a creche. But anyway, I think that was a point you could have referred to, because there is a legal requirement on the employer. He can't say, "Oh, I'll do it if it's going to benefit me, benefit my business in some way." This is a legal requirement, and the problem is that even though Interstate Migrant Workmen Act has so many provisions saying the contractor who brings these workers has to get a license at the place of origin of migration, and also come here and register himself with the labor department, disclosing how many children he has brought, how many workers he has brought. All of them have to be registered. So that's totally not happening. So that is where there is total abdication of the legal responsibility on the part of the employer. And we also were able to get from the Karnataka Labor Department. There's also the question that where the legal requirement says only if you have 20 women workers, you need to put a creche, or if you have 50 women workers, you need to put a creche. Then what about those construction sites where there may be just one or two children? How do you make the employer responsible for it? Because it's unviable for him to really put a creche for one or two children. So, because of that, when Mr. Manivannan was the labor secretary in Karnataka, we approached him with the memorandum, and we said that first of all, he should create migrant workmen's housing, to house the seasonal migrants in every ward or a group of wards, so that they get decent housing, because that's also very necessary if the child has to have a safe and a decent place to live in. And as part of that memorandum, we also asked him that if there is a school going child, aged 6 to 14, then it should be the employer's duty to ferry the child to the nearest school, or make some arrangement of schooling for that child, for those children. And we also said that if there is a child less than 6 years, he has to make arrangement for that child to be ferried to the nearest Anganwadi, because it may be unviable for him to start a creche of his own for just one or two children. So, like you said, there has to be a community settlement based creche facility, along with a workplace facility, if there are enough number of children there to be looked after. So, and surprisingly, Mr. Manivannan issued a government order saying that this has to be followed by all employers. And as a result of that, they have started a migrant housing colony in Dodballapur with the BOCW funds, and that is one of its kind in Karnataka. And he did start several creches also at the work site, but they were all closed down because they were being run with NGO participation, and I don't know why they closed them all down recently. And you also refer to the Kusinamane. Yes, it's a very good initiative of Sidramaya, but that Kusinamane is located at the Gram Panchayat headquarters. And how accessible is it to every working woman, who may be working in her settlement level habitation. So how can she come all the way to the Gram Panchayat headquarters to drop the child? He has opened, I think, 5,000 Kuchana manes across Karnataka. So we have been campaigning, and the other impact of this Kuchana money is that it is splitting the children between women and child and RDPR. The same small percentage of children who are less than 6 years old, the Anganwadi is right there in her settlement. Yeah, but the creche facility is not there in the Anganwadi. She has to come to the Gram Panchayat headquarters to get creche facility. So we have been campaigning that you need to just upgrade the existing Anganwadis, which are more than 69,000 in number, and may upgrade them to the level of a creche for the 6 month to 3 year olds also, so that they get service there, and so that that facility is available to all women, working women, not just the migrant workers, as a community-based, facility, which makes it viable. All kinds of women workers can use that same facility, and it doesn't have to be sex, construction site specific. So we have been campaigning for that, and also saying that splitting the provision of this facility between the Gram Panchayat department as well as the WCD is, splitting the same children between two different departments, which is weakening the entire service and weakening the ICDS system, because you are setting up separate creches. So, and we're also asking that this whole 0 to 6 year old need for care, health, and nutrition, as well as pre-primary education, needs to be uh, made into a right through a law. Because right now, even ICDS is just a scheme, and even the Kusina Mane is just a scheme actually, uh, but of course linked to the NREGA in some way. But unless it is delivered by one department, the facilities are going to become unviable, because the children are going to be split between so many different organizations and departments. So I'll stop here. I think I've spoken a lot.
Thanks, Katyani. It was lovely to see you after a very long time, actually. Um, I mean, you're right about the Interstate Migration Act. One could, and actually, there are many acts that one could go through, and there is something in each one of them, because everybody has thought about it legally but hasn't thought about it operationally. I also don't disagree with you about everything else that you have said. But to just say that I think there are, and this is a fight that I have also had internally quite a lot, right? I think both have to happen simultaneously. We have to fight the long battle of making sure that there is state investment in childcare, there's employer investment in childcare, and we campaign for better policies, GOs, and so on. But at the same time, there are some very pragmatic things that have to be done, say in the next 1 month, to just make sure that one generation, we don't lose out a generation of child while we fight the long battle. So I think in my head both those strategies have to be fought together. So while we push for that GO to come through, to make sure that there's labor, housing, and so on, parallelly we have to negotiate with employers, because otherwise these childcare centers are not going to come up, and we are going to lose an entire generation of kids who don't have access to basic nutrition and education. So I think both these are happening at different scales from different groups. With the state governments, with the employers. Take is that we still have to think about childcare as a very primarily labor issue, which has not happened yet. In fact, within the labor movement, I think it still happened a lot within the state, but not so much within the unions and the labor movement. You rarely see a construction workers union agree that childcare is actually a central problem, right? I think that's where I'm also hinting towards, like that kind of rethinking of uh, what is the place that childcare has in our everyday life has to happen from within the labor movement also. And I'm saying that instead of going to say that we need better housing for workers and then talking about childcare, childcare in fact is a very quote unquote soft subject that employers are actually quite willing to set up in comparison to entire workers housing. So you start with that, and that's a great entry point to then do many other things and have many other kinds of negotiations with the employer. So I think it's just one of the strategies, not the only strategy to think about childcare. On Kusina Mane, I mean, I don't want to use up this conversation to talk about it, but there's some really interesting things that have come up from the model. It's the first of its kind. It's a pilot project in the country. So there's some very interesting things we can learn from it in terms of what does it actually take to scale up a program. One is the vision and the ideal creche program that we would all want. But one is about where is the money coming from, what are the budgetary sort of pulls that various bureaucrats and departments are doing to make a program like this actually work out. We are doing a learning study. Hopefully, we'll have something more to say and perhaps a separate presentation on that someday.
Yeah, thank you.
Do we have any more questions or comments from the participants?
I have a question.
Please
Can you
go.
hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name is Melvin. I'm a senior research associate with Desktops Network. Hi, Divya. Thank you for sharing the insightful findings from your study. So, similarly, we at Desktops Network had done a similar study on care work, especially Kusina Maris in Karnataka. We did field work in Ballari, Bengaluru rural, and two more other districts. And two things that we observed was that crash uptake is primarily associated with higher labor force participation, in the sense that people who are already participating in the labor force are the ones who were putting their children in these crashes. And second is that despite all these things, there are a lot of women who are not even working, who are actually relying on Kusena manis. So the question is twofold in a way. In your study, have there been instances where migrant women, though not employed, have accessed or benefited from these worksite childcare crashes? And second is again continued to Kusina Mainly because they are at the panchayat level, gram panchayat level. So has there been any restrictions faced by migrant women in accessing Kusina Mane crashes? These are the two questions that we have.
Yeah, so in terms of our non-migrant women accessing worksite, no, because the worksite crashes are
Divya, we are not able to hear you.
settlement. Can you hear me now?
Better.
No? Okay.
Yes,
So I
it's
was saying
better.
that, which is why from the beginning I've been saying that it's not enough only to have worksite creches. You also need to have creches at informal settlements so that it caters to both the working women and the non-working women. Because if it's a worksite creche, only the workers will be able to access it. We absolutely need them, but only those are not going to help solve the problem. And the other thing is, I understand that the push for childcare within the policy landscape has happened to support female labor force participation. It's almost embarrassing how low our female labor force participation is, and childcare is thought of as a very critical pathway to enable more women to join the labor force. But I think within itself, childcare is really important. Even if a mother is a non-working mother, childcare is still a huge financial resource, space constraint that women actually encounter, and so these childcare centers could be beneficial to all mothers, whether they're working or not, especially those who live in very low resource environments. So that's the other thing. With respect to Kusinam again, it's Kusina Money is part of the NREGA program. It was meant for a specific program. So to evaluate actually helping women would be really though from what I understand, they are hoping to expand it, and in several panchayats that do have additional budgets, they are, also making it open to non-NREGA women workers. But at the same time, I mean, I think all of these points that you have raised about location, it being only in the panchayat and not being accessible, all of these are fair points and points well taken, and hopefully it's something that the policymakers think through more carefully in the second phase of the project.
Would you mind if I clarify a few things that are some observation from our field study? So yes, I mean it is being kind of established in the purview of Manrega, and even though that is there, there is no policy in such that is stringently implemented across the state in the sense that some places, for example, Ballari, the crèche facilities shut down when Manreka is not happening. Whereas, let's say in some other districts, for example, this is what we saw in Bengaluru rural. This will keep going on regardless whether there is Manreka work happening or not. And it was also open to anybody. Like, so even women who were not working in Manreka, even who were not working at all, were actually able to access the crash facility. So there were a lot of women who were actually having regular salary workers, people working with the state department. They also send their children to these crashes. So I think as a policy, it's not uniformly implemented. So that is like one thing that we have found, and we totally agree with like what you have been showing through your findings.
Yeah, absolutely. I think to think of creche as a universal service, irrespective of the employment status of the mother, is also really important. It's very fundamental to employment, but also to think about it in non-employment situations is as important because we are thinking about the safety of the child, basic ECD and nutrition access, and so on. So both ways, it's really important. Yeah, and all points well taken in terms of Kusina Money. It's a new program. We'll have to wait and watch how it sort of plays out in the next few years. It definitely is an interesting model, but we have to see where it goes from here.
We'll take one more maybe.
Actually, while somebody's thinking through the question, I also wanted to add that very often, childcare, the demand for childcare doesn't exist because families also don't think of it as something that can happen outside of the household. So I think even convincing households that there is a care center and it can actually facilitate better outcomes for the child is actually a long-term conversation around gender norms again. So again, around social norms again, what kinds of imagination families and communities have about childcare. So very often, just the opening of a center is not going to get more women to use the center. It's also a very like historical question
Mm.
just opening of creches are not going to be useful. I think it's a demand that has will generate itself over a period of time as people get okay with the idea of care also taking place outside of the household in some sense.
Um, while there are people thinking about questions or comments, maybe I could ask one last one. Um, in your study, Divya, among unions, where do you see this kind of demand being raised? Are there particular sectors where demand for childcare is more stronger, or are there central unions where this demand is coming from? Where is this conversation happening?
Honestly, it is not. I mean, among the few unions that I have engaged with, this conversation is not families don't think of it as something that can happen outside the household. It isn't something that comes up in union meetings and so on. We've very closely been working with the Domestic Workers Union in Jaipur, and there, of course, it has come quite a bit because it's also a women's, union because it's domestic workers and the leadership is female, and so there have been some conversations there. But within the mainstream unions, I don't think this is a priority in that sense. And I can't speak for across the country. I'm sure there are some unions that are thinking about it, but at least the big ones that I have engaged with have not talked about it.
Hmm. Um, Maybe one last one from my side, Divya. Also, in some of our studies, we sort of see that employers see this as a burden, an additional burden. to provide childcare facilities, and that sort of adversely affects women's employment. So, and there's also discrimination in hiring in that. These are unintended outcomes, right? Once we push for certain kinds of facilities for a group of workers. So, any thoughts on those? Because we've
Yeah,
seen
I mean that.
not
Hmm.
just for informal women workers, right, at the lowest end of the employment ladder, but we're also seeing that, say, for instance, women scientists, researchers, all of them have been facing childcare. It's a crisis of childcare provision, right? And it becomes employers look at it as an additional burden, and then and that sort of also translates to discriminatory hiring.
Yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt about that. And I think that's the sort of chicken and egg story with the labor force, participation. You want more women in the workforce, but childcare has to be sorted out. But if childcare gets sorted out, then less women in the workforce because the employer doesn't want. So it's sort of a cycle. But I think that is why public provisioning of childcare is absolutely critical. And in the case of employers, also there has to be a third party in some sense because not all employers can give quality services. I can imagine it happening in more formal spaces because they could perhaps hire a trained worker. But say at a construction site, I would definitely want a third party like an NGO or a local community-based organization or an SHG involved because the builder is not in the business of providing childcare. And it's a very, I mean, we don't think of it that way, but it is a very specialized, skilled job. But I agree with you. There is, I mean, this has been a historical debate within
Right.
economists have been talking about it, for many, many decades about how everything like maternity benefits, whether it's leave or, care infrastructure, then is like the disincentive for employers to hire women. But I think that's like a very long-term debate that I don't have a quick answer to.
Right. Okay, I'm just going to ask one last time. Do we have any more comments or reflections? Okay. I don't think yet. But thank you so much for initiating this conversation, Divya. I think as Work Parent Free, we are greatly privileged to have known you and listened to your insights even earlier. But we are very happy that you could bring it for us, through us, with to a larger audience. And thank you for making these connections and sort of foregrounding the question of care within the labor rights discourse. And to think about women work and how do we rethink some of these questions of who is responsible for care, and how do we think about women's response, how do we think of women's work and recognition of this care work that they are sort of performing in such disproportionate ways. So thank you so much for being here with us today and for this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.